Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to CoSA's May webinar. I'm Eric Emerson, State Archivist of South Carolina, and I'm excited to serve as moderator for today's session, which is focused on conscious editing. So we've got three presenters with us today. I'd like to welcome all three of them. Dawn Howard Lucas is a technical services archivist with a background in the history of the health sciences and the history of the American South. In her current role at the Wilson Special Collections Library, Dawn works with curators to accession new collections and writes and revises collection descriptions with a conscious editing lens. She is professionally active in the Society of American Archivists, the Society of North Carolina Archivists and Librarians, Archivists, and Museum Professionals in the history of health sciences. We also have Aaron Smithers with us. He's a folklorist with a background in documentary studies and television and radio production. Aaron has worked as a preservation audio engineer, archivist, and curatorial assistant at the Southern Folklife Collection, and currently works with researchers, students, and faculty at the Special Collections Research and Instruction as a Special Collections Research and Instruction librarian at Wilson Library. He also serves as the music editor for Southern Cultures, the journal for the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC, and as an instructor of audio documentary at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. And last but not least, we have with us Laura Hart, who writes and consciously edits archival description for Wilson Special Collections Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She holds master's degrees in American history and library and information science, and was an inaugural co-chair of the University Library's Conscious Editing Steering Committee. Laura has presented at numerous professional conferences and symposiums, including the College of William and Mary's Lemon Project Conference, the Sunshine State Digital Network's Introduction to Conscious Editing series, and UNC Chapel Hill's Difficult Discourse and Race, Racism, and Racial Equity Symposiums. So please join me in welcoming all three of our speakers today. And Laura, I will turn it over to you.
I think I'm going to kick off our presentation today, if we're all ready. Thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate that introduction. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with state archivists today. We definitely rely on and collaborate with our state archives in Raleigh quite a bit from Wilson Library, and it's a relationship that we should definitely foster as much as possible. So again, thanks so much for inviting us here. My name is Aaron Smithers, and I'm going to start our presentation today to try to provide some context about conscious editing, about our institution, where conscious editing comes from, and then Dawn is going to talk more about conscious editing as we imagine it, our values, a definition, and then Laura is going to provide a lot of examples of how we're applying conscious editing in our description right now at Wilson Library. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks so much. Just making sure I didn't need to do something. Thank you. We do want to provide a land acknowledgement, and we do recognize the land and sovereignty of Native and Indigenous nations in Chapel Hill in North Carolina and North America and across the world. The University of North Carolina sits on the land of the Occaneechi, Shakori, Eno, and Sissipaw peoples. Native lands have shifted between Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and the nations named here are not representative of all Indigenous peoples who belong to these lands. Next slide, please. We recognize that using words to acknowledge the rightful land ownership of Native nations does not go far enough. True land acknowledgement does not happen unless Native nations have full control over their land, and the actions of the university and greater North Carolina community demonstrate recognition of Native American sovereignty. And I want to acknowledge that this text comes from the work of the Anti-Racist Graduate Worker Collective at UNC Chapel Hill, whose work has been vital to a lot of the some of the work that we've done in conscious editing, and whose work as graduate student workers for the university also should be acknowledged and fully compensated. Next slide, please. Also want to introduce the remainder of our conscious editing steering committee, The current members, Megan Alston, Michelle Cronquist, Monica Figueroa, Laura Hart, Don Lucas, Rachel Reynolds, myself, Kimber Thomas, and Matthew Turi. We also want to acknowledge our past members, Jennifer Coggins, Jackie Dean, Sonoe Nakasone, one of the original co-chairs of the Conscious Setting Steering Committee as well, and Tiara Thomas. Much like the Graduate Student Worker Collective, we are here presenting today as a group whose ideas and all of our work has been created as a group, as a team, and we are just the spokespersons here representing all of these members of the Conscious Setting Steering Committee whose work we have relied on. Next slide, please. As we're talking about, we're here speaking on behalf of the committee, we believe that representation matters. I think here it's important to acknowledge that as all three white cisgender persons, we recognize that there is irreparable loss when inclusion is diminished by white practicality. And so much like the work of our fellow committee members, we want to acknowledge the labors of the rest of our co-workers whose work we rely on, as well as the communities of color whose materials are represented in our collections, the labor of our colleagues and the labor of the people whose materials that we steward at the library, the communities, the community archivists whose work we hold. We need to, their work is too often hidden and undercompensated, and it's important to honor this work and compensate it equitably. Next slide, please. As we consider the context of our work at Wilson Library, it's important to talk about the origins of Wilson Library and UNC Chapel Hill. UNC is a historically white college and university, and as such, it was not a passive beneficiary of slavery and conquest. Because historically white universities extracted labor from enslaved Black Americans and considered them as property, they were complicit, UNC is complicit, in producing and reproducing anti-Blackness. And I want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Kimber Thomas, one of the members of the Conscious Setting Steering Committee, whose ideas and words I'm largely drawing from here. The relationships between colonial slavery and colonial colleges like UNC, as well as the legacies of slavery in American institutions, are vast and deep, and can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade when higher education in the colonies expanded rapidly. By acknowledging the ways in which universities, including our own, benefited from settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, we can begin to uncover and attempt to remediate histories of inclusion, exclusion, and the degradation at our institution and in our collections. As a historically white university, we should look at how our past has shaped the way that we have used language to describe materials in our archives, and how the assumptions embedded in that language have been passed down and normalized. Next slide, please. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that Wilson Library was created largely as a Jim Crow archive. The Southern Historical Collection was established in 1930, created by Dr. J.R. Hamilton, a student of William Dunning, whose scholarship offered a specific interpretation of reconstruction, that reinforced a lost cause narrative of Southern history. And as historian Eric Foner has stated, it was part of the edifice of the Jim Crow system. While Hamilton was instrumental in collecting manuscript and family papers that form a cornerstone of the over 5,000 collections that make up the Southern Historical Collection, his work in archival collecting at the University of North Carolina was dedicated to supporting a singularly white narrative of history. That singular narrative was reinforced over time through our description, through instruction, through mediated access to materials, through digitization, through the reuse of all these materials in documentaries and histories and journalism, and all the ways that stories get told and remembered based on our collections. And this, just to point to the quotation in the slide, a quotation from Elizabeth Cotton, who was a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the assistant to Hamilton, who explained to a student reporter that the Southern Archival Collections acquiring at the Southern Historical Collection would place a master-slave relations prior to the Civil War in a new and more favorable light. Next slide, please. Equally, Our collections have been unevenly described over 9 decades by dozens of different individuals with varying levels of knowledge about the historical context of documents and collections. In a language acceptable at one point in time that's no longer acceptable has not been remediated. Colonialism has shaped knowledge organization work by contributing to the marginalization and misrepresentation of Native American and Indigenous peoples. Materials in our archives, those held by non-tribal organizations, which resulting in the loss, suppression, and censorship of many Indigenous ways of life and documented materials. Understanding how colonization works through these practices will help us to describe content more accurately and remediate historically underrepresented materials related to Native Americans and Indigenous life, history, and culture. But in order to do this, we must acknowledge that we don't have access to the knowledge systems we aim to represent in our collections all the time. And we recognize that Indigenous groups have knowledge about the ways that archival materials should be represented. This is another important facet for us to think about when we're thinking about conscious editing. Next slide, please. Finally, our description has been, academic librarians have created and compiled much of Wilson Library's legacy description, largely for an academic research audience. The choice of audience, coupled with the choice to use an objective tone and voice influenced that, the choice to use an objective tone and voice influenced the content and style of our description. With the goals of objectivity and historical context, we often faithfully transcribe captions and titles from historical images or from legacy description, regardless of harmful, outdated, or inaccurate terminology in that description. The unspoken assumption was that the academic research audience understood historical context and could harness outdated language to answer their historical questions. Not all of our researchers are academics, and the stylistic decisions and word choices we made in centering an academic audience alienate communities whose members are represented in the materials and likely close opportunities and pathways for discovery. Next slide, please. All of this work and conscious editing work at the university libraries at UNC is taking place within the library's Reckoning Initiative framework. Vice Provost for University Libraries Elaine Westbrooks issued a call to action that launched the Reckoning Initiative, and it represents a commitment to go beyond a mere focus on diversity. The library is committed to using racial equity, inclusion, and social justice as a lens for all of our work, to analyze all of our work, and a means by which we achieve our mission. Long-term, this means in education and training, programmatic work to center underrepresented groups, systems analysis to identify failings like our descriptive practices, and integrating anti-racism practices into library work. In support of this goal, this means the library rejects the concept of neutrality and embraces the values of social justice. Everyone in the university libraries has a part to play in building and maintaining a culture of inclusivity. And I'm going to welcome my colleague, Dawn Lucas here, who's going to talk to us more and explain to us about what we mean with conscious editing within all these contexts.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Okay, so building on everything that Aaron has just said, let's talk about how we can make archives and special collections more inclusive and in line with these reckoning goals. So you can see here that we've provided a definition of conscious editing, which is assessing, writing, and refining texts and visual information with deliberate care and a critical awareness of bias, privilege, and power. So this includes turning away from writing descriptions for academic audiences that are from a predominantly white point of view. Next slide, please. And we want to do that to support this vision, which includes people connecting with the past without the impediments created by structural racism, bigotry, discrimination, and privilege. It also includes engaging with community, with institutional support for truth and reconciliation movements, challenging historical narratives that have erased or silenced people and cultures. And finally, it includes institutions and other traditional centers of power reckoning with difficult past and launching meaningful and far-reaching reparations programs and funds. So next slide, please. So what values go along with this vision? You can see 6 values listed here. People first, accessibility, honesty, equity, cultural humility, and transparency. So for example, we should strive to describe enslaved people as people who were children and parents and significant others and who had names and lived meaningful lives, and not just pieces of property listed in the back of an enslaver's plantation account book. So if we know their names, we should name them, as we have tended to name the white people in our collections. And we should also strive to call out acts of white violence, racism, and white supremacy against Black, Native American, or other non-white communities instead of downplaying it or ignoring it, or using deliberately misleading terms such as race riots that serve to reframe events in people's minds over time. These values can be applied to many categories, that's including but not limited to race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, abilities or disabilities. And Laura is going to give several examples of redescription using these values just a little bit later in the presentation. So next slide, please. Again, adhering to these values helps us to move away from the traditional way we've written collection descriptions and finding aids. But as you can see here, they can guide work in other areas beyond finding aids, such as metadata for digital content, alt text for online photographs, the SACO funnel, subject heading and remapping, exhibition text and spaces, research services, classroom instruction, continuing education, and even collecting and collection management. So this is really all of our work, and it's not something that can be relegated to just the technical services department or just the arrangement and description department, and it definitely is not something that can be relegated to just one person in an organization. So as I mentioned, Laura is going to give a lot of examples in a few minutes. So I'm not going to talk about everything listed here, but I am going to talk about some of the things. I'll talk about SACO funnels, subject heading remapping, research services, classroom instruction, and collecting and collection management. So let's start with SACO funnels. So a little background in case everyone isn't familiar with SACO funnels. SACO is the Library of Congress Subject Authority Cooperative Program. It enables member institutions to submit proposals for additions to Library of Congress subject headings, LC genre form terms, LC demographic group terms, LC medium of performance thesaurus for music, and LC classification schedules. And the SACO funnel is a group of libraries or catalogers from various libraries that have joined together to contribute subject authority records for inclusion in the Library of Congress subject headings. So funnel participants may work in the same subject area, such as the SACO Judaica funnel or the SACO music funnel, or they may be regionally based, like the SACO Hawaii Pacific funnel or the SACO Colorado Mountain funnel. One of our colleagues, Michelle Cronquist, is a co-coordinator for the African American subject funnel, concentrating on the creation of new subject headings and the changing or updating of old subject headings relating to the African American experience. So some of the new terms that have been created via this funnel are blackface, Black Wall Streets, and but existing subject headings can be hard to change, and sometimes we want to make changes to subject headings that offend, exclude, and dehumanize people, even without approval from the Library of Congress. So some of you might know about a group of Dartmouth College students who lobbied to change the subject heading illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants. And even though the heading is still officially illegal aliens, if you search for that term in UNC's library catalog, you will receive search results for undocumented immigrants. And this is because the Triangle Research Libraries Network, a regional consortium to which UNC belongs, remapped illegal aliens with undocumented immigrants. So they didn't change the term, but they have changed how it displays to end users. Other examples include replacing slaves with enslaved persons and dirty war with Terrorismo de Estado Argentina. So a little bit about research services. As I mentioned, the push to change illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants was led by a group of college students who didn't understand why this offensive term appeared in their library's catalog. To them, the appearance of this term made the library appear unwelcoming and complicitly upholding the white power structure. So the language we use does affect our users, and sometimes it prevents potential researchers from becoming actual researchers. If you don't feel welcome in the research room, why should you spend time there? So we therefore need to evaluate all language used with our researchers, whether it's in our finding aids, in our digitized resources, on our signage, or in our verbal language. And it's also in the decor. For example, walls decorated by large framed portraits of white men could be redecorated to appeal to more diverse users. When planning for classroom instruction, think about the impact that your words and the materials presented will have on the students. Consider the goals of the instruction session and choose materials that align with those goals. So some points to consider. Whose points of view are being presented? And are there materials that are being presented just because someone thinks they're interesting or shocking, even though some students might find them offensive? If so, are there other examples that will get the point across without needlessly causing discomfort? And if you don't have other examples, then consider warning the students ahead of time and allow them to opt out if needed. So this all brings me to my last point, which is about collecting and collection management. At many institutions, collecting has largely documented the white power structure to the exclusion of other groups. So perhaps you want to highlight one of those other groups only to discover that you don't have very much in your collections about them. Now, the question of how to diversify your collections is really another presentation unto itself, and it's outside the scope of this presentation. But a question that is relevant to this presentation is, are you sure you don't have very much? Perhaps you do, but those materials weren't described in a way to highlight that fact. So something we can do is to evaluate and redescribe materials to better highlight what we do have and make a deliberate effort going forward to better evaluate, describe the new materials coming in the door. And so having said all that, I am now going to turn the presentation over to Laura, who is going to walk us through a lot of examples. So thank you, Laura. Take it away.
Thank you, Dawn. Conscious editing has two essential meanings. Conscious editing is a mindset for the library's discourse, a mindset that puts people first, as Dawn was talking about. It is an ethos of thoughtful care taken with the spoken, written, and visual language we use in the library. Conscious editing is also the active efforts we are making to address racism and marginalization in our legacy descriptions of collection materials. In that work, we frame and reframe narratives with language that is plain, direct, and most of all, humane and anti-racist. We surface and center people and communities whose lived experiences we have marginalized, silenced, or erased. And we strive to create narrative frames that do not perpetuate trauma from the oppression and violence documented in our collections. Conscious editing is so much more than just the removal of offensive and outdated terminology. It is rethinking how we portray and present our collections, not just for an academic audience, but also for anyone who wants to find and make connections with the past. With these examples, I hope to show you what conscious editing can do and why we need it. For centering Indigenous epistemologies, colonialism has shaped knowledge organization work and led to the marginalization and misrepresentation of Native American and Indigenous peoples in archives, especially in archives held by non-tribal organizations. These power dynamics are evident through practices of using pejorative terms such as reservation Indian or chief to describe indigenous people, using Western-oriented terms like Custer's Last Stand to describe indigenous histories, experiences, and people, misnaming people with terms like Eskimo, standardizing or conflating all indigenous people and societies as a homogeneous other, Western historical periodization, or dividing American history into tidy periods like pre-contact and Indian removal, using euphemistic language to describe white violence and genocide of indigenous people. For example, using the benign term Cherokee migration to describe the forced removal of people on the Trail of Tears. In this example, the phrase Native American matters in the legacy description suggests that the experience of indigenous groups can be seen as homogeneous. In the edited description, the Cherokee Nation is made the primary agent. Historical background is added to center the perspectives of indigenous peoples. The unqualified reference to migration is replaced with forced removal and forced migration. A reference to the Trail of Tears, a search term which was omitted in the legacy description, is added. Problematic Library of Congress subject headings, which Dawn alluded to with our subject heading remapping and our SACO funnel work. As Dawn said, the Library of Congress subject heading is a widely used controlled vocabulary for cataloging. It is more than 120 years old, and many of the terms reflect America's white supremacist and patriarchal culture. A long-established controlled vocabulary like LCSH is not easily changed or updated, which makes LCSH rife with problems for conscious editing. We can choose to omit problematic and dehumanizing LCSH terms from our description when there are other terms that will better meet our needs. The subject headings you see here were used for the collection called Student Action for Farm Workers. The collection contains oral history interviews, photographs, videos, and audio recordings and publications documenting the life stories and experiences of farm workers, many of whom migrated from Mexico and Central America to the southeastern United States. The Legacy Finding Aid describes the farm workers as Latinos, many of whom were, quote, illegal immigrants in the United States. And we therefore added the corresponding LCSH terms for illegal aliens. When we looked at the description through a conscious editing lens, we determined that the content of the collection really did not pertain to the agricultural worker citizenship status. Rather, the collection's content was about people living in the American South after migrating from other countries. We revised the description to refer to the workers as migrants from Mexico and Central America. We removed the illegal alien subject heading altogether and replaced them with subject headings for Central Americans and Mexicans, which more accurately represent the humanity of the people being described in this collection and whose voices are in this collection. Unhiding the invisible norm of whiteness. In legacy description, we typically have provided racial, ethnic, and national identities only for Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous historical actors represented in the collections. With conscious editing, we approach the description of historical actors equitably by providing white identities for historical actors represented in our collections. By adding white identities for historical actors, we unhide the invisible norm of white perspectives and we acknowledge the ubiquitous whiteness of our collections. Adding white identities also provides non-academic audiences with historical context that may help in their analysis of the collections, because we cannot assume that the complexities of race in American history are broadly understood by our expanding audiences outside the academy and the academic field of history. Describing relationships of power by identifying people claimed as property in family papers. Wilson Library's Southern Historical Collection holds more than 500 archival record groups from the 18th and 19th centuries that document people enslaved on plantations and farms, at mills, fisheries, railroads and ports, at colleges and universities, including UNC Chapel Hill, and in towns and cities across the American South. These collections include documents created by the enslavers to manage the people that they claimed as property. The enslavers often recorded information, including names, ages, birth dates, death dates, occupations, illnesses, and acts of resistance. This is genealogical and family history information that cannot be found anywhere else in public records. These documents are there to be mined by genealogists and family historians and community historians, but they are obscured by description focused on the white people who were enslavers and by the organizing principle of provenance that centered the white people who had donated the collection. In this example of conscious editing, the contents list has been changed so that the details of Black people who were enslaved by the white Dorset family come first, elevating the prominence of Black lives and enhancing the discoverability in the archive. The enslaved people are named and known dates for their lives are provided. Words such as trafficking are used to clearly show the power dynamic between the white Dorset family and the people they enslaved, and it does not mask the reality of enslaved people's lives. Removing the invisible norm of Protestant Christianity. In archival collections that document the American South, Protestant Christianity is another invisible norm. And the assumption reinforced in our legacy description is that the people represented in our archival collections are Protestant Christians unless otherwise stated. With conscious editing, we accurately identify, contextualize, and clarify religious affiliations that are relevant to the collection. We ensure that information provided about other Christian denominations, non-Christian religions, or other belief systems and non-belief systems is also both relevant and accurate. The legacy description here for the Ellen Mordecai account book includes mention of a, quote, Jewish missionary. Whereas missionaries are common in Christianity, they are almost unheard of in Judaism. Based on the description in other parts of the finding aid, Jewish missionary likely refers to a person or organization that promotes Christianity to Jews, not the other way around. Even if this term was used in the described account book, Jewish missionary is nonsensical to researchers familiar with Judaism and misleading to researchers who are not. Also, note the change to the phrase poor women and children to women and children experiencing poverty for a people-first approach to describing poverty. Rectifying ableist language. The use of outdated, offensive, inaccurate, or inhumane terms to describe physical, intellectual, and mental disabilities and other health issues is ableist and harmful. Colloquial and non-literal use of outdated terms once associated with mental health, such as insane or lunatic, or with physical and intellectual disabilities, such as crippled or feeble, is another form of ableist language. Used metaphorically to describe unrelated concepts, the current language of disability can also be harmful by reinforcing long-held ideas of what is normal and abnormal. Ableist language erases personhood by reducing an individual's identity to their disability, and it marginalizes individuals with disabilities by equating disability with abnormality. In this example, the offensive name given to an enslaved person is removed. Enslaved person is used instead of slave to highlight the person's humanity, not their condition in bondage. People first language is used to emphasize that Tom was a person who had a disability. To call him an idiot is offensive and dehumanizing, and so we remove that language as well. Rectifying the erasure and misrepresentation of people of color. Historically, white people in the United States have had exclusive power to name and misname and to identify and misidentify people not considered white within mainstream systems such as archives. Examples include white colonialists naming indigenous peoples Indians, rather than using names of nations or language groups in indigenous language. White lawmakers creating the one-drop rule to identify and determine Blackness, and white Americans mistaking Asian and Latinx people for the wrong Asian or Latinx ethnicity or national group, especially during times of ethnic scapegoating and violence. In this example, the term American Indians obscures the name of the sovereign nation whose people are represented in the collection and is replaced in the edited description with people from the Navajo Nation. The term relocation center euphemizes the unconstitutional incarceration of American citizens and residents during the Second World War because of their Japanese ancestry. This has been replaced with the more accurate term concentration camp. Brief historical information has been added to counteract the erasure and minimization of these events in the historical record. Creating equitable metadata and inclusive alt text for photographs. Alt text and descriptive metadata provide information about the content of an image and affect the discoverability of the image online. Descriptive metadata provides information about an image's content, who or what is depicted. And metadata also provides context, what time and what place are depicted in an image and who took the picture. Alt text is a concise description of an image or a short explanation of an image's function on a website. Inserted into the coding of a website or web page, alt text improves web accessibility for people with a visual impairment because the text is machine readable. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Wilson Library piloted new descriptive processes in work-from-home projects, and we have started to build guidelines for correcting, editing, and adding alt text. For historical photographs and archival collections, we have enhanced description of the image by adding proper names of all individuals when known, information about gender, age, and relationships, and racial or ethnic identity of individuals, including white identities of people depicted in the images. Language that assigns gender, race, or ethnicity and relationships is often considered necessary as points of access, but they should be applied equitably. In this example, the alt tags for these two photographs were originally generated by software. The edited alt texts add race identity. Note that the alt text for the second image addresses the default that whiteness is the norm, thus doesn't need to be labeled. Contextualizing historically white universities. Aaron discussed this earlier, and we'll show you an example. Historically white colleges and universities, HWCUs, are institutions of higher learning that are direct byproducts of systemic social and racial discrimination against African Americans and people of color in the United States. By acknowledging all the ways in which universities, including our own, benefited from settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, we can begin to uncover and attempt to remediate histories of inclusion, exclusion, and degradation at our institution and in our collections. In this example, the consciously edited description surfaces information about the lives and identities of Black people in the history of UNC Chapel Hill that was omitted from the legacy description. Explicitly naming UNC Chapel Hill as a historically white college and university labels it as an institution of higher learning that is a direct byproduct of systemic social and racial discrimination. It also provides necessary context for understanding campus history and the images in this album. Removing euphemistic language describing white racial violence against Black communities. With conscious editing, we replaced language that mischaracterizes or silences incidents of white racial violence with language that is plain, direct, nuanced, and humane. In the legacy description for this example, the collection abstract highlights the career of Alfred M. Waddell, who became mayor of Wilmington, North Carolina, following the November 1898 massacre and coup d'etat. The 1898 massacre and coup is instead made the primary focus in the edited description, making this critical moment in history more visible. Whereas the legacy description is historically accurate and does mention Waddell's quote, involvement in the white supremacy campaign and Wilmington race riot of 1898, it does not make a clear connection between the two. It also refers to the event as a, quote, race riot instead of a massacre and coup against the Black community and legitimately elected Black government officials. The term race riot is placed in brackets after conscious editing to indicate that this was a term in use in the past. That term was intentionally misleading as it was meant to relieve white perpetrators of responsibility for their actions and prevent Black victims from seeking justice against them. The consciously edited collection abstract still accurately describes Waddell's career and provides additional context about his role in the massacre and coup. Addressing racist language in transcribed titles, captions, and other descriptive texts. Collection materials in Wilson Library frequently contain racist and harmful language in the content and in the descriptive text, such as titles and captions, that were provided by the creators or the collection's former owners. Racist language from original material was then transcribed by librarians and archivists into archival description, catalog records, and descriptive metadata attached to digital objects. This language can provide historical context, but also repeats language that reinforces biases, amplifies violence, and adds to existing trauma. This is an example of the decision by archivists in the Wilson Special Collections Library to remove transcriptions of titles and captions from finding aids because they contained racial slurs. This change is documented in a processing note. Original titles remain on physical documents and digitized copies. Contextualizing lost cause mythology. Lost cause mythology is a false interpretation of the American Civil War and its causes. This lost cause mythology promotes nostalgia for the Old South and glorifies the Confederacy while masking the inhumanity of chattel slavery and denying the role that slavery played as the primary cause of the American Civil War. In this example, the original description includes the racist trope of a benevolent slave owner and even highlights that the enslaver, quote, paid his hands for Sunday work and extra assignments, as though this act deserves special recognition. The edited description removes this language, which promotes lost cause mythology and perpetuates oppressive and racist distortions around the American South's history and culture. After conscious editing, detailed information about the enslaved people whose lives were recorded in plantation records and account books are listed to center and surface Black lives in this collection and to aid in discovery. Warning users about racist and harmful content. Content warnings refer to the language and content of the special collection materials themselves, rather than the language created or published by library staff to describe these materials. Content warnings are most often applied in a presentation context, be it virtual or on-site. For special collections libraries, this may include digital collections, gallery exhibits, instructional courses, finding aids, bibliographic catalog records, or physical enclosures such as folders. In this example, a content warning was added to the introductory panel for the Race Deconstructed: Science and the Making of Race exhibition in Wilson Library that was held in early 2020. This information was placed at the entry points to the exhibit. This exhibition includes historical attitudes about race that are offensive and dehumanizing. We present these items in order to provide a more complete and critical examination of the past. If you have questions or concerns about the contents of this exhibit, we invite you to contact us. This information was placed at the entry points to the exhibition. It warns visitors, explains the choice to include harmful content, and invites visitors to contact the library with questions or concerns. We chose to begin with a descriptive statement and make no comment about how people may be affected. We added a sentence to justify why we were exhibiting this material, and we ended with an invitation to contact us with questions or concerns as part of our duty of care. This is an example of a content warning in the metadata for a medical school yearbook. Labeled as a usage statement, and given at the item level, this description warns of the presence of people wearing blackface in the resource, emphasizing that this and similar content are incompatible with the values of the university today. In this example, A content warning has been added to an item described in an archival finding aid. A note at item level describes challenging content and warns viewers that the video includes images of animal death and blood. At this point, we are happy to take your questions, and we would like to again thank you for being here with us today to talk about and learn about conscious editing. And I just want to make another thank you to Lisa Johnston of CoSA and her colleagues who made this possible for us to be here today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And I'd like to thank all of our presenters for your time today and being willing to do this for our organization. And we have a few minutes available for some questions. Please post them in the chat box, or you can ask in person. I will start this thing off with what I think I know the answer to it, but has the Wilson Library had any pushback for its conscious editing practices? And if so, can you give us some of the objections and how you address them?
Yes, so we have had a little bit of pushback, and the pushback that we have gotten has mostly been around the addition of racial and ethnic identities for white people. We have had donors contact us and request takedown of the racial identities that have been included for either themselves or their ancestors, and we have taken down on request. We have attempted to explain our reasoning, but of course accept that person's preference to not be identified. Yeah, Dawn or Aaron, would you like to add to that?
The other thing I would add is I don't know if it's really pushback, but there are some decisions that we have made at UNC that other institutions have made different decisions. So, for instance, when we removed racial slurs from the finding aid, that's something we did very intentionally, and that's something that some other institutions are very intentionally not doing because they it removes context from the finding. And so we have our reasons for making our decision, and they have their reasons for making their decision. And not every institution decisions.
So, Aaron, do you have anything
I don't. I mean, from a research librarian perspective, I've never encountered anyone commenting on how we have redescribed anything in my experience. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question. If an institution wanted to begin a conscious editing project, how would you recommend scoping a beginning project?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think one of the reasons that we have had, we have a long journey ahead of us. We have just started this at UNC and don't see ourselves as anywhere near completion. We see it as a conscious editing as an ongoing area for the library, and we have that sort of support in our administration. Aaron talked about the reckoning initiative, into which this fits very well. I think for organizations who are just getting started, I think where we started getting momentum was when we formed the Conscious Editing Steering Committee, and we we took our time to really come to an understanding of what conscious editing was, what the vision and values that Dawn discussed earlier in the presentation were. And with that foundation, we have now been able to support the work in the various departments that Dawn also discussed, the work of the SACO funnel, the work in research and instruction, and so forth. So I think, you know, obviously that might not work well in other organizations, but I think bringing people together is a good place to start with some community conversations.
So there's also a question about sharing any details about what type of institutional documentation guides you use in your conscious editing work.
I just added a link to the chat to, which is just a link to the conscious editing page on the UNC website. And on that page, there's a short bibliography that includes a presentation by Laura, an article by head of archival technical services at UNC, Jackie Dean, and a master's thesis by one of our founding members, Tiara Thomas. And along with that work, we've compiled an extensive bibliography of concurrent research into how language is used in libraries, and we're using that to kind of inform our work. But all three of these resources provide really excellent bibliographies for some initial reading. I don't know if Laura or Dawn have anything to add to that.
No, I don't think so, except to say I'm sorry, I got distracted there for a moment, but we are currently working on and are close to finishing our guide to conscious editing at Wilson Special Collections Library, which reflects a lot of the work that we have already done and that we want to do. So I think the guide will be an important building block for us moving forward.
What about, have you had any patrons who've experienced difficulties finding information due to their unfamiliarity with new conscious editing terms? Has anybody notified you of that?
I've never experienced that just in our research department, and I can't think of a time any of my colleagues have either. I mean, they're not so extreme that it causes people to not be able to find what they're looking for. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was, you know, not a difficult decision to just remove racist slurs from our finding aids. Yeah.
And finally, there's another question about external audiences. Have you invited users or other external audiences to suggest potential collections or content for revision? Or are you receiving suggestions from users about revisions?
I mean, no. Everyone acknowledges we need more user studies. One of the other aspects of the Reckoning Initiative is a series of grants provided by the University Librarian, where UNC library staff members can apply for extra funding to engage in anti-racist work. And one of those is a technical services department applied and received one to conduct a series of focus groups with African-American genealogists to start to try to answer these questions. Through our community-driven archive projects in the Southern Historical Collection, there have been opportunities to work with communities to determine, you know, different kinds of ways that they may want their materials described. But, you know, outreach and user experience studies is something that's desperately needed. You know, we want to make sure that people are being compensated for that work, and so that's sometimes a challenge to negotiate. And, you know, one of the ways that we're able to do that, at least right now, is starting with these grants.
Okay. And the last question, I think you've probably answered this, is has UNC done any collaborative work with historically excluded and marginalized communities to get feedback on terminology and descriptions? I'm certain you've probably done that.
I think as Aaron suggested, that is a major area for growth that we need, and we are exploring that. Right now, our focus is very much on our more than 500 collections documenting slavery in the American South, and we, as Aaron mentioned, are anxious to talk to the communities whose ancestors are represented in these collections to determine how we can make these materials more accessible and reframe them in a way that is, again, not that is anti-racist and humane and gives people the opportunity to find these materials without wading through just layers and layers of our institution's whiteness, frankly.
Sure. Well, I think that's our last. That's all the time we have for questions. I want to once again thank Laura Hart, Dawn Howard-Lucas, and Aaron Smithers for your time today and for all that you did to put this presentation together and to enlighten us about your efforts at the Wilson Library. And I will turn it over to Lisa now and wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Laura, Dawn, and Aaron for a very informative presentation. And for just a couple seconds, I'd like to remind you, we also have additional webinars and activities coming up. So if you're interested, go to the CoSA website. In June, we're going to be launching another In Conversation. This will be with Mark Puentes, Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Inclusion, and Diversity at Purdue Libraries. Naturally, we're available to be contacted at all these different means. We hope you'll reach out to us as you have questions, concerns, and suggestions and ideas. And naturally, none of this would be possible without thanks to all of our sponsors, and we appreciate them. So thank you them for all of their contributions to CoSA's work. And lastly, it's going to be a small evaluation after when you log off, and we hope that you will take a moment and at least answer the questions. It really does help our education committee as we plan future programs. If you have suggestions for topics, how did you like this topic? What could we do differently? So please let us know. And with that, everyone, thank you again to our presenters. Thank you, Eric, for being our moderator. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.